You ever watch an entire lake die in one night? Because I did. And the woman responsible was drinking champagne less than 300 yards away. The smell hit me before I even reached the dock. Rotting algae, gasoline, and that thick metallic scent dead fish leave behind when they float too long near the surface. My boots pounded across the wet planks as flashlight beams bounced over the water, and every swing of light revealed more white bellies drifting against the reeds. Thousands of them. Bass fry. Bluegill. Catfish fingerlings. 20 years of breeding stock floating under the Texas moon like somebody had dumped the entire lake upside down. The aeration pumps had gone silent. That was the first thing I noticed. No low electrical hum. No bubbling current rolling across the hatchery pens. Just silence. Heavy, wrong silence. The kind that makes your stomach tighten before your brain catches up. I climbed onto the service platform and felt cold water soaking through my jeans as I dropped beside the control box. The steel latch had been cut clean through. Fresh metal shavings still glittered under my flashlight. Bolt cutters. Whoever did it knew exactly where to hit. The backup oxygen lines dangled into the water like snapped veins, and the emergency generator sat dead with its fuel valve twisted shut. The air felt thick enough to chew. Somewhere across the lake, music drifted through the dark. Country music. Laughter. Glass bottles clinking together. Willow Creek Anglers Club was hosting their annual midnight cast tournament at the clubhouse, and from where I knelt beside $20,000 worth of dead fish, I could see strings of patio lights glowing through the trees like some rich suburban carnival. Then I heard her voice carrying over the water. Brenda Whitlock. Sharp as broken glass even from a distance. Laughing. Talking about finally cleaning up the lakefront. My jaw locked so hard I tasted blood where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. See, Brenda had spent the last year calling my hatchery an eyesore. Said the tanks lowered property values. Said the oxygen pumps sounded industrial. Said the smell offended her fishing club guests sipping whiskey on cedar decks built 10 feet from the same water they bragged about every weekend online. What she didn't understand was simple. Those fish floating around me? They were the only reason her precious lake still had anything alive in it at all. I grew up believing water remembers everything. My father used to tell me that while we sat on overturned bait buckets beside this same lake at 5 in the morning, steam rolling off black coffee into the cold Texas air, he would point across the water while the sunrise turned the cypress trees orange and say, "A lake keeps score, Nathan. Treat it right, and it feeds families for generations. Mistreat it, and eventually it takes everything back." Back then, Willow Creek was nothing but ranchland, dirt roads, and old aluminum fishing boats with patched seats. No gated entrances. No luxury docks. No million-dollar homes pretending to be lake cabins. Just water, fish, and people who understood how hard both were to keep alive during a drought. My father built this hatchery in 1989 with 2 rusted excavators and a welding torch he bought at a farm auction outside Waco. Every concrete tank behind my house still carries scars from his original work. Uneven seams. Crooked drain valves. Fingerprints pressed into old cement. I can still hear the sharp hiss of his welding torch bouncing off the water at night while moths circled the work lights. He raised largemouth bass here long before Willow Creek became some polished fishing destination for people wearing designer boots they had never stepped in mud with. By the time I took over, we were stocking lakes all over central Texas. Private ranches, county reservoirs. Youth fishing programs. Even state tournaments. The funny thing is, half the people living around this lake had no clue where their fish actually came from. They bragged about trophy bass on social media while standing over fish my father raised by hand in oxygen tanks 30 years ago. That hatchery was never glamorous. It smelled like lake weeds, wet lumber, diesel fuel, and fish feed soaked into old wood. My shirts permanently carried that scent no matter how many times I washed them. But to me, that smell meant home. It meant my father laughing through cigarette smoke while fixing broken pumps at midnight during summer heat waves. It meant mornings spent checking water temperatures before school. It meant survival. Then Willow Creek Anglers Club showed up and turned the shoreline into a country club for people who thought money could replace knowledge. And Brenda Whitlock became the queen of all of it. She wore pressed white golf jackets like armor and smiled with the kind of polished fake kindness that made you check your wallet afterward. The first time she toured my hatchery, she stepped around puddles like the ground offended her. Then she looked at the breeding tanks and asked me, dead serious, if the fish smell could be managed better for property aesthetics. That was the moment I knew she saw this lake as decoration, not something alive. The harassment started small. That is how people like Brenda operate. They do not kick your door down. They smile first. Then they tighten the screws one turn at a time until your whole life starts creaking under pressure. 3 weeks after that hatchery tour, I found the first violation notice taped to my gate. Excessive mechanical noise affecting community enjoyment. $50 fine. I remember standing there in work boots still damp from the lake, reading that bright yellow paper while cicadas screamed from the oak trees overhead. The so-called excessive noise was my oxygen system. Without those pumps circulating water through the breeding tanks, the fish would suffocate in less than 8 hours during summer heat. Texas in July does not forgive mistakes. The air around the hatchery already felt like wet concrete before sunrise most mornings. I tried explaining that to Brenda during the next HOA meeting at the clubhouse. Big mistake. The room smelled like lemon polish and expensive perfume, and every ceiling fan spun lazily above rows of people sipping wine from plastic cups while staring at me like I had dragged a tractor into church. Brenda stood beside a projector screen wearing one of those fitted white country club jackets with gold buttons. Behind her flashed giant photos of my hatchery tanks. She had zoomed in on algae stains along the concrete edges like she was presenting crime scene evidence. Industrial contamination near residential water access, she announced in that polished realtor voice of hers. Several people nodded immediately because Brenda had spent years training this neighborhood to react first and think later. Then she clicked to another slide. This one showed feed barrels stacked beside my dock after delivery day. Commercial storage materials visible from lakefront properties. You would have thought I was storing radioactive waste instead of fish food. I kept my mouth shut while people whispered around me. One man near the back muttered that the hatchery probably explained why the lake smelled earthy after rainstorms. Another woman asked whether fish breeding chemicals leaked into the water supply. Chemicals. I nearly laughed out loud at that one. My father raised fish with river water, oxygen, and patience. But Brenda was good at turning ignorance into theater. That night, the HOA voted to begin environmental compliance monitoring around my property. Which basically meant strangers in polo shirts started wandering near my docks with clipboards every weekend pretending to inspect things they did not understand. Then came the fishing club fences. One morning I woke up to fresh cedar posts hammered along the western shoreline beside my property line. Decorative signs hung from iron brackets reading private anglers access. The sharp smell of cut cedar drifted through the fog while nail guns echoed across the water. They were claiming parts of the shoreline my father maintained for 30 years. And Brenda smiled through every second of it like she already owned the lake. The real trouble started when Brenda realized I was not leaving quietly. People like her expect resistance to crack fast. They count on paperwork, embarrassment, and exhaustion doing the work for them. But every morning after those HOA meetings, I still walked the hatchery before sunrise with a flashlight and a cup of burnt coffee in my hand just like my father taught me. I checked dissolved oxygen levels. Tested water temperature. Cleaned intake screens clogged with drifting lake grass. The pumps hummed steadily through the fog while her fishing club members cruised past in polished bass boats pretending not to stare. Then the sabotage began. Little things at first. One of the intake valves mysteriously jammed open overnight, draining nearly 4,000 gallons before I caught it. A week later, somebody dumped lawn fertilizer pellets into one of the fry tanks. Enough to cloud the water bright green by morning. The sharp chemical smell hit me the second I stepped onto the dock. Fish floated near the surface gasping while foam gathered along the tank edges like dirty soap. I spent 12 straight hours flushing water lines under 96-degree heat trying to save what stock I could. My shirt felt glued to my back with sweat and lake water by the end of it. Then came the inspectors. County environmental officers showed up in pressed uniforms carrying clipboards and thermal mugs like they were filming a documentary about dangerous wetlands. Brenda walked beside them smiling the entire time. She wore oversized sunglasses and white leather boots completely useless near mud, but somehow she still acted like she owned every inch of shoreline. One inspector asked whether my hatchery discharge system had been reviewed recently. Another wanted records proving my fish populations were not artificially altering recreational balance. Recreational balance. That phrase stayed in my head all afternoon while I watched two teenagers from the fishing club yank 6-pound bass from water stocked entirely by my family. Every fish in that lake existed because somebody like me spent years protecting spawning cycles and water quality while people like Brenda drank cocktails beside decorative fire pits. But the pressure kept building. The HOA filed complaints about generator noise during storms. The fishing club claimed my feed barges blocked scenic lake views. Somebody even posted photos online comparing my hatchery to industrial agriculture. Industrial. I laughed when I saw that one because half the expensive docks around this lake were built by contractors using my access roads and shoreline permits decades ago. Yet somehow the man keeping the ecosystem alive became the problem. Then one humid Thursday night, I came home from checking upper spillway filters and found fresh spray paint across the hatchery storage shed. Clean up the lake. Bright white paint dripping down old cedar boards while moths buzzed around the security lights. I stood there breathing in wet paint fumes and algae rot, listening to music drifting from Brenda's clubhouse party across the water. That was the moment something clicked in my head. Brenda Whitlock was not trying to improve the lake. She was trying to erase the people who built it. By August, the hatchery barely looked alive. The constant bubbling that once rolled across the tanks like steady rain had thinned to weak sputters because I could not afford to keep replacing damaged equipment every week. Every repair bill stacked higher on my workbench beside unpaid county fees and HOA violation notices printed on thick cream-colored paper like they were wedding invitations instead of threats. The smell around the lake changed too. Anybody who works water long enough notices those things. Healthy lake water smells earthy and clean after sunrise. But stressed water turns sour. Heavy. Like wet carpet left too long in summer heat. I noticed it first near the shallow coves beside the fishing club marina. The baitfish schools had started thinning out. Herons stopped gathering near the reeds at dawn. Even the insects sounded quieter after dark. Nature whispers before it screams. Brenda never understood that. One afternoon I drove into town for replacement pump seals and came back to find two fishing club members standing beside my lower tanks with phones out recording video. One of them wore mirrored sunglasses and a bright blue tournament jersey covered in sponsor logos. He pointed toward dead fingerlings floating near a drain screen and said, loud enough for me to hear, "This is exactly what Brenda warned us about." I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked toward them, exhausted enough to feel it in my knees. "Those fish died because somebody shut off my oxygen line last night," I told him. Neither man answered. They just kept filming. That was the moment I realized Brenda had already built the narrative she wanted. In her version of the story, she was not destroying the hatchery. She was saving the lake from me. 3 days later, the county suspended one of my temporary stocking permits pending environmental review. That single letter cost me nearly $40,000 in canceled contracts before the week ended. Summer youth fishing camps backed out. A private ranch outside Marble Falls canceled their base delivery. Even the local bait shop stopped returning my calls. I sat alone inside the feed shed one evening staring at old invoices while thunder rolled over the lake outside. Rain hammered the tin roof hard enough to rattle the fluorescent lights overhead. The place smelled like damp wood, fish meal, and motor oil. My father's old thermos still sat on the shelf above the workbench coated in dust. I kept thinking about how proud he had been when the hatchery finally became profitable enough to support both of us. Now I was watching 30 years of work collapse because one woman decided the shoreline needed to look prettier for cocktail parties. Then the final hit came. Around 2 in the morning during a storm, the backup circulation system failed completely. I drove through pouring rain with windshield wipers barely keeping up, and by the time I reached the upper breeding tanks, hundreds more fish were already floating against the barriers under flashes of lightning. The generator panel stood open in the rain. Wires hanging loose. Somebody had been there again. I leaned against the soaked railing listening to thunder shake the water while dead fish drifted past my boots. For the first time in my life, I honestly thought the hatchery might be finished. The discovery happened because of a power outage and an old tackle box. That is the honest truth. 3 days after the storm wrecked my circulation system, the electricity cut out across half the county during another heat wave. No pumps. No lights. Just thick August air pressing against the house like wet blankets. I spent most of the evening hauling portable oxygen tanks between breeding pools by flashlight while sweat dripped off my elbows onto the dock. Around midnight, I finally gave up trying to save one of the lower tanks and went into my father's old workshop looking for spare generator fuses. The place smelled exactly the same as it did when I was 12 years old. Cedar shavings. Pipe tobacco. Grease soaked into old pine shelves. Dust floated through flashlight beams while rain tapped softly against the metal roof. I pulled open drawer after drawer filled with rusted hooks, invoices, lake surveys, and handwritten stocking logs going back decades. Then I found the tackle box. Green metal. Dent on one corner from when my father dropped it off the dock sometime in the 90s. Inside were not fishing lures. Inside were folders. Thick ones. County permits. State environmental contracts. Hand-signed agreements. My heartbeat actually slowed while I sat there reading through them because suddenly things started making sense in a very different way. See, Willow Creek was never a naturally sustaining base lake. The water chemistry was wrong for it. Too warm in late summer. Not enough deep oxygen pockets after drought years. Back in 1994, the county almost classified the lake as biologically unstable for recreational fishing. Then my father stepped in. He designed a supplemental stocking program through the hatchery that quietly maintained fish populations year-round without public attention. Every tournament. Every trophy base photo hanging inside Brenda's clubhouse. Every fishing membership sold for the last 20 years depended on fish raised inside my tanks. I kept reading while thunder rolled far out over the water. One contract stopped me cold. Willow Creek Anglers Club Renewal Agreement. Signed 18 years ago by Brenda herself and 2 previous HOA presidents. The fishing club had been purchasing supplemental stocking support from my family the entire time. Not directly, of course. The payments moved through environmental maintenance fees buried inside HOA budgets where nobody would question them. Then came the real bombshell. Attached to the contract was a Texas Parks and Wildlife Compliance Notice. If hatchery supplementation ceased for longer than 30 consecutive days, the lake would fail minimum sport fish sustainability thresholds required for licensed tournament operations. Meaning no tournaments. No commercial fishing events. No membership certifications. No luxury lake branding. Brenda Whitlock had spent a year attacking the one system keeping her entire fishing club alive. I remember leaning back in my father's old chair while generator rainwater dripped from my jacket onto the floorboards. Somewhere across the dark lake, music still floated faintly from the clubhouse patio. Brenda probably thought she was winning. But sitting there surrounded by old permits and dusty records, I finally understood something important. The lake did not belong to the HOA. The HOA depended on me. The funny thing about real leverage is that you do not need to scream when you finally have it. The next morning, I walked the hatchery before sunrise like always, but for the first time in months, I was not angry. I was calm. The water still smelled sour near the damaged breeding tanks, and dead shad still drifted against the reeds along the eastern bank, but now I understood something Brenda did not. I was not trapped with the lake. The lake was trapped with me. Fog rolled low across the water while I carried my father's old contract folders back into the house. By 8 o'clock, I had scanned every document and emailed copies to a fisheries attorney in Austin named Daniel Reeves. Old Texas guy with silver hair, a base boat worth more than my truck, and zero patience for HOA politics. He called me less than an hour later. "Nathan," he said, chewing ice through the phone line, "these people are out of their minds. They cannot operate a tournament lake without supplementation reports. You pull support, they are finished." I remember staring out the kitchen window toward Brenda's precious clubhouse while coffee burned my tongue. Finished. That word sat heavy in my chest all day. But I did not rush. My father used to say impatient fishermen go home hungry. So instead of filing lawsuits immediately, I started preparing quietly. First, I shut down all future stocking schedules connected to Willow Creek. No more base deliveries. No more bluegill replenishment. No more emergency fry support after summer die-offs. I rerouted every healthy juvenile fish shipment to other county lakes still under contract. Trucks rolled out of my property before dawn carrying oxygen tanks and transport barrels while the fishing club members slept peacefully behind their gated entrances. Then I repaired the damaged hatchery systems just enough to stabilize what breeding stock remained. New locks. Backup cameras hidden inside cedar posts. Fresh steel covers over the oxygen controls. I even installed silent battery alarms beneath the dock panels. Every metallic click of a wrench against steel sounded sharper now. More deliberate. Meanwhile, Brenda kept escalating publicly because she thought she had already won. She announced the biggest fishing tournament in Willow Creek history for Labor Day weekend. $5,000 entry fees. Sponsors coming in from Dallas and Houston. Food trucks. Live music. Drone coverage over the lake at sunrise. She bragged online that the event would celebrate the restoration of a cleaner, healthier shoreline. Cleaner. I nearly laughed reading that while standing knee-deep in breeding tanks she had almost destroyed. But the real masterpiece came 3 days before the tournament. That was when Daniel filed the official notice with Texas Parks and Wildlife. Suspension of hatchery supplementation support pending environmental sabotage investigation. Attached were photos of the cut oxygen lines, damaged systems, and documented fish losses. I still remember the sound of rain tapping against the office windows while I signed the paperwork. Brenda thought she was planning a fishing celebration. She had no idea she was about to host the public autopsy of her entire lake. Labor Day morning arrived hot and windless, the kind of Texas heat that settles over the water before sunrise and makes the entire lake smell like wet cedar and engine oil. I stood on my dock drinking black coffee while tournament boats gathered near the clubhouse marina across the water. Even from half a mile away, I could hear music blasting through loudspeakers and generators rattling behind food trucks. Drone cameras buzzed overhead like giant insects catching sunrise footage for social media. Brenda had turned the whole thing into a spectacle. Giant sponsor banners hung from the clubhouse deck. Men in matching fishing jerseys posed for photos beside polished bass boats worth more than most people's houses. And right in the middle of it all stood Brenda Whitlock in a bright white jacket smiling like she had built the lake herself. By 7 o'clock, the first warning signs started appearing. Boats returned early. Quietly at first. One team blamed bad conditions. Another complained about dead water near the northern coves. Then another came back with completely empty live wells. I watched through binoculars while frustration spread across the marina like gasoline smoke. Professional tournament fishermen know when a lake feels wrong. No bait movement. No feeding patterns. No structure activity. The water had gone still in all the worst ways. By 8:30, angry voices were echoing across the docks loud enough to carry over open water. One man slammed a rod locker shut hard enough to shake the boat beside him. Another accused the club of hiding a fish kill problem before the tournament. Brenda kept smiling through all of it, but I noticed her posture changing. Tight shoulders. Forced laughter. Quick glances toward the deeper channels where the best fishing should have been happening. Then the state trucks arrived. White Texas parks and wildlife vehicles rolled into the parking lot while the tournament live-stream drones hovered overhead, still broadcasting everything live online. You could almost feel the atmosphere shift from celebration to panic in real time. Clipboard-carrying officials stepped onto the marina asking for water quality reports, supplementation records, and environmental compliance documentation. Brenda's smile disappeared completely when one of them mentioned suspended hatchery support. I still remember the sharp screech of microphone feedback cutting through the music as tournament organizers tried to shut down announcements mid-sentence. Then came the real collapse. One of the state biologists opened a report in front of the crowd explaining exactly how dependent Willow Creek had become on artificial stocking support over the last 2 decades. People started realizing what that meant almost immediately. Membership fees. Property values. Tournament revenue. Every bit of it tied directly to the hatchery Brenda spent months attacking. The shouting started after that. Homeowners demanding answers. Sponsors packing equipment into trailers. Fishermen furious about $5,000 entry fees for a dead lake. And standing in the middle of that collapsing circus was Brenda Whitlock, sweating through her perfect white jacket while state investigators questioned her about vandalism reports tied to my damaged hatchery systems. I watched the whole thing from across the water while the morning sun burned through the fog. My father used to say lakes keep score eventually. Turns out he was right. 3 months later, the lake finally smelled clean again. Not the fake chemical clean Brenda liked spraying around the clubhouse flower beds either. Real clean. Wet earth after sunrise. Fresh cedar along the docks. Cool water rolling through healthy reeds while blue herons stalked the shallows at dawn. The first time I heard baitfish flickering against the shoreline again, I actually stopped working just to listen. Funny how silence can tell you something is dying, but small sounds are what tell you it survived. Willow Creek Anglers Club never recovered after the investigation. Tournament sponsors pulled out almost immediately once the environmental reports became public. Homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions about where their HOA fees had really gone all those years. The fishing club board dissolved within 6 weeks. Brenda resigned before they could formally remove her. Last I heard, she and her husband quietly sold their house below asking price and moved outside Dallas somewhere with no lakefront at all. The giant cedar sign at the clubhouse entrance came down during October storms. I watched workers haul it away on a flatbed trailer while rain hammered the shoreline and dead leaves spun across the empty parking lot. No more valet golf carts. No more champagne tournaments. Just an abandoned dock creaking against the water my father spent half his life protecting. As for me, I rebuilt the hatchery slower than I wanted but stronger than before. Local conservation groups stepped in after the state reports became public. Then county schools started calling about educational fishing programs for kids. By spring, every Saturday morning the shoreline was full of teenagers learning water testing instead of rich men arguing over tournament rankings. The old clubhouse became a public conservation center after the county bought the property during the HOA restructuring. Sometimes I still laugh thinking about that. Brenda tried to erase the hatchery because she thought it ruined the image of the lake. Now the entire lake revolves around it openly. The best part though came one quiet evening in late April. I was walking the western shoreline checking juvenile bass cages when I passed the old marina docks. The sunset turned the water copper orange while frogs croaked from the reeds and somebody grilled burgers somewhere across the cove. A father stood beside the railing teaching his little girl how to cast a fishing line. She missed badly and tangled the lure in the dock ropes. I heard her groan in frustration while he laughed softly and showed her how to reset the reel. Then she looked down into the water and shouted because a school of young bass had gathered beneath the dock lights. Fish from my hatchery. Healthy ones. Hundreds of them. I stood there listening to that little girl laugh across the water while warm wind moved through the cypress trees overhead. My father was right all along. Water remembers everything. And eventually, it rewards the people who protected it instead of the ones who only wanted to own the view.